Absolutely. I think we've teased everyone long enough and we need to get to
Sure.
the question. But, I think contextualizing the current state of, unpaid women's labor in the US and just kind of making that differentiation around like a token lady boss at top versus a coalition of working women coming together across all spheres of society is important to kind of set the ground for why women have better sex under socialism.
Right. Yeah. So, I want to just sort of stop for a second and kind of unpack like how that book even came about.
Oh,
because I think
please.
that's an interesting story as well. And then the argument sort of makes a little bit more sense in context. So as I said, I've been teaching this class called Sex and Socialism since 2003. And I've written 6 books about gender and socialism specifically and post-socialism, looking at the ways in which the status of women changed between 1989 in Eastern Europe and 1991 in the Soviet Union and the present day and what happened afterwards. So as a social scientist, when you are interested in testing a theory, like how are women's lives and even women's sex lives going to be affected by an economic system? This is not an easy experiment to do because it's like I can't take a bunch of girls and put them in a lab and grow one group up under capitalism and the other group up under socialism and then see how their sex lives change or how their personal lives are different. That's an unethical study. And not to mention it's kind of impossible to do because you can't do that. So you look for what's called a natural experiment. And the natural experiment here is clearly that you had a bunch of countries in Eastern Europe which were socialist for a long time, 70 years in the Soviet Union, about 45 years in Eastern Europe. And then it ended and they became capitalist. And so, wow, as a social scientist, I'm an ethnographer, and I say, this is the perfect natural experiment to show me how political economic systems impact women's rights. This is so important because there's empirical data here. You can actually see how did women fare economically, politically, sociologically. There are all sorts of things that you could study. And you can also study sexologically, how did people's relationships change? And so the way that this book came about was that I published a book in 2017 called Red Hangover, which was a sort of retrospective book looking at the legacies of the Bolshevik Revolution 100 years after that revolution. And in that chapter, in that book, there was a chapter called Gross Domestic Orgasms. And it was essentially a kind of discussion of a lecture that I had given in Freiburg in what was West Germany in, I think it was 2014 or 2015, about all of this really interesting sexological research around whether or not East German women had more orgasms than West German women, which was a very, very touchy topic. There was a wonderful documentary film called Do Communists Have Better Sex that I was basically showing clips from, and then my job was to sort of lead a discussion. That was all I was supposed to do. And talk about the kind of research that had been done in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia around issues of sexuality. And my West German audience, mostly men, were really uncomfortable and really, really unhappy with the nature of this discussion. So I wrote an essay about it, which became a chapter in this book, which then became the August 2017 New York Times op-ed, Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism. And that just kind of blew up in my face. There were all sorts of ways in which I was really not expecting whatsoever the reaction that I got. I actually didn't think what I was saying was all that controversial because in my world, it's a fairly accepted truism that socialist countries were generally pretty progressive on women's rights. Especially at a much earlier stage than the United States or many West European countries. I can give you all sorts of examples of this, but it's generally kind of recognized that the Eastern Bloc countries really committed to promoting women's education, women's professional opportunities, women's economic independence, women's sexual autonomy, and so on and so forth, far earlier than places like the United States or West Germany or the United Kingdom. But boy, as you can imagine, people in the United States were not really happy about this.
I mean, you hit like the two biggest triggers for a lot of people in the US, which is, communism, socialism, sex.
And
arguably,
sex.
like, yeah.
Right,
That's gonna be a
exactly.
disaster.
And so boy, this is what happens, I think, when you spend way too much time as an academic working in your own little field and not really engaging with the wider world around you. I was just sort of blown away by that. So the book was the product of essentially me getting a call from a New York publishing house saying, hey, can you make this op-ed into a book? And I was very reluctant to do so at first because I was an academic and I'd never written for a popular audience, and I wasn't sure that I had the chops to kind of like make that move. But I thought it was really important, and I did really feel, because I have, like I said, been teaching this class for 17 years more or less, that there are these really important arguments that a lot of people don't realize about how women's economic independence impacts our personal lives. So, feminists like to say that the personal is political. And I, in the book, try to invert that and say that the political is personal. But even more so, I want to argue that the pleasureful is political. There's a direct line between what's happening in the political economic system under which we live and the way that it impacts our personal lives. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that that's not true, that you close the door to your bedroom and somehow all of the world disappears and it's just like you and your partner or partners and your intimate relationships. That's just not reality. So the argument in the book, first of all, there are, I think, 6 chapters in the book, and only 2 of them deal with sex, right? So there's one on motherhood, there's one on leadership, there's one on citizenship, there's one on work, but there are 2 on sex. And those are the ones that everybody wants to talk about because everybody likes to talk about sex, right?
Yeah.
So the argument is very simple. It's that when you live in a society with greater social safety nets, where women are not forced or compelled in some way to exchange not only their emotions and their affections, but also their physical intimacy in exchange for somebody who can pay the rent or somebody who can support them and their children, women are going to have greater levels of economic independence, which means very simply that they're going to choose their partners. And I am very specifically in this book talking about heterosexual relationships. They're going to choose their partners on the basis of mutual attraction, mutual affection, mutual interests, and love, because they're not going to feel compelled to marry somebody just because, or to be with somebody just because that person has access to resources that woman otherwise wouldn't have. And so that's a hypothesis that can be empirically tested. And what I do in the book is I basically try to present the evidence of those empirical tests to the extent that they exist. I take this idea of sexual economics theory and I try to apply it empirically to the situation in Eastern Europe as it transitioned from being a socialist state command economy to a democratic free market economy, and what happened to the status of women and to their intimate personal relationships over the last 30 years.
Yeah, and the book is so wonderful. I was acknowledging you for this when we got on this morning. I like anything that makes socialist ideas and just general kind of imagining of what society could be. And, if we have the heart and the brain power to make things shift and better for people, your writing is just so refreshing to me because it's interesting and it's personal and it's funny and it's sarcastic. Early on when I was, can't remember if I was waitressing or nannying, but there was this wealthy woman I was working for. And I remember her saying something about, she wanted something from her husband. And she was like, okay, well, on Saturday night when I have him in the right position, I'll ask. Oh. And I was so shocked. And I think I would have kind of rolled my eyes at I think you used the alias Lisha or something. There's a chapter you talk about the woman who's, kind of upper middle class. Her husband doesn't want her to work. She stays home with the kids. And, she basically, you overhear a conversation where, she doesn't have money to go out. She wants to go clothes shopping. And the husband says, you blew all the money buying things for the kids and the house, you can't make more money. And I think I kind of would have been like, yeah, right. Had it not been for this, right. This comment that I heard when I was 18 or 19 that really shocked me. And then again, another story I'm going to pull from the book because I think it's important to underline. There's a professor friend of yours who has, I think, accidentally has twins, has a toddler and then has like three kids under 4, some kind of child care financial, catastrophe. But also if there's just one kid would be, incredibly expensive as well. And she doesn't want to sacrifice her career. So she makes something like 70 cents a year after paying for childcare and continuing to work for like 4 or 5 years. And then her kids can go to maybe public school, offsets that cost. And she hasn't, she's still on the track for tenure or, continuing to work. So I just love those like very real grounded examples, because then it's not so theoretical. It's not so like, well, women in the U.S. like, you don't know the reality. Like we can work, we don't have to stay home. You can be a mom, you can do it all. Is so the mentality now, and that's just not the economic reality.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you kind of putting in these like very real and grounded anecdotes.